somebody also who is following these developments for us very closely is our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who has been, of course, monitoring proceedings in New York for us. Good afternoon to you, Sherwin, and thank you so much for this. All right, so President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address the session this afternoon too, but perhaps as we preview that, let's just get a sense on the significance of Biden's address today. I mean, it is his last address at the UN General Assembly. It also comes at a time where his foreign policy legacy is under the microscope, as the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza and Lebanon are raging on.
Yeah, and I think President Biden, Unati, they're leaning into his decision earlier this year to step away from the re-election race and making that point in the United Nations General Assembly. World leaders are serving their fourth, fifth, sixth terms in office, right? I remember former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, that in one of his last speeches at the General Assembly was almost unable to walk to the podium given his age. And so really trying to sort of push his administration's focus that has been on elevating democracy as a counterpoint to the growth that they've seen in terms of authoritarianism around the world. And so very much a swan song from the incumbent in the United States, soon to be former president, mentioning the Vice President Kamala Harris, sort of perhaps a little bit of an introduction to who might be at the podium next year. Of course, that isn't a shoe-in because there is still an election to be held in November. But just to sort of give you a run-through of what Biden talked about, as you mentioned, he talked about this being his fourth time in the General Assembly, but also his last. He said, he spoke about how he'd spoken about out against apartheid in the 1980s. He talked about the accomplishment of getting Osama bin Laden, how he's been rebuilding alliances around the world. They recognize the challenges of Ukraine, Gaza, democracy that is at risk, the promise of AI and the significant risks that those new technologies present to the world. He talked about his administration making the largest investment in climate change in the history of the United States. He talked about our task is to make sure forces holding us together are stronger than those pulling us apart. He said he believed that we were at an inflection point. He reasserted his U.S. commitment to the UN Charter. He spoke about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We cannot grow weary, he said. We cannot ease our support for Ukraine. We have a responsibility to manage relationships with China so that it doesn't recede into conflict. He said the world mustn't flinch at the horrors of October 7th, 250 innocents taken hostage. Their families are going through hell. But then he also spoke about how innocent civilians in Gaza were also going through hell and reasserted the need for a ceasefire. Of course, this long anticipated and expected Unati that simply hasn't met the moment, despite it being endorsed by the UN Security Council, led by the United States, Qatar and Egypt, but they simply have not been able to get agreement from Hamas and Israel in that regard. He also talked about Sudan. The world needs to stop arming the generals. He said they need to stop blocking aid to the Sudanese people, and the war needs to stop now. He got applause for that. We must now move quickly to respond to the Mpox outbreak in Africa. He pledged, this is newsworthy, some 1 million vaccine doses to arrest the outbreak of Mpox in Africa. And I believe the United States is committing at least $500 million to that effort. He also touched on the U.S. Decision to endorse 2 African permanent seats in the UN Security Council, of course, without the veto. He talked about AI and how the world needs to come together to manage this new technology. And then ending with this, he talked about we are all here for the people, right? Democracy is central to how his administration has been run since he took office. He said being president was the honor of his life, but we are here to serve the people, not the other way around. Quoting former President Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. A broad sense of what President Joe Biden said to the General Assembly
Absolutely.
today.
You're right, Sherwin, and it does kind of feel like a goodbye of sorts. But let's look at what transpired a little bit earlier, if you can, just touch on, we heard, of course, from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. We also heard from the leaders of Brazil and Turkey. What Guterres, of course, said in as far as, the wars that we are seeing in the world, saying that a growing number of governments and others feel entitled to get out of jail free cards. They can trample international law. They can violate United Nations Charter. They can turn a blind eye on international human rights conventions or the decisions of international courts, almost as if laying the foundation also for President Cyril Ramaphosa perhaps to touch on just some of the standpoint from South Africa in as far as that war in Gaza is concerned, Sherwin.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great summary of essentially what the Secretary General said. And at the center of this address by the UN Secretary General, I think the words human suffering, a chronic failure to find solutions, the word impunity resonated throughout that address. He talked about the world is in a whirlwind, in an era of epic transformation. Geopolitical divisions are deepening. The planet keeps heating, wars rage with no clue of how they will end. And so, to your point, a reference to the need to uphold international law, not just when it's convenient, but when it's central to the UN Charter, which all 193 member states of the United Nations subscribe to. He talked about we cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza. Of course, Lebanon right now is on the brink, he said. Nothing, he said, can justify the acts of terror by Hamas on October 7th, but also nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. And you're correct, I imagine this will be a central theme to President Cyril Ramaphosa's address, given South Africa's efforts at the International Court of Justice. On Sudan, he talked about the brutal power struggle that has led to famine in parts of Sudan. Human suffering, chronic failure, epitomizing what Sudanese are going through now. We are moving, he talked about a multipolar world, but we are not there yet. We are in the purgatory of polarity. Must reaffirm the UN Charter, respect for international law, to support the implementation of decisions of international courts, as you mentioned, Unati. The center of it all is the Secretary General's message, Unati. Human rights must undergird how we respond to these crises, and pointing to the fact that only 10% of the speakers in the General Assembly listed to speak here are going to be women, which is a huge impediment and a huge denunciation, essentially, of Goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which talks about, gender equity and women's empowerment by 2030, and we are far away from that. He also talked about the planet being in a climate meltdown, the debt situation that is imperiling the ability, particularly of developing countries like South Africa, to meet the commitments to the Sustainable Development Agenda. He said that there was a future without fossil fuels that is certain, but a fair and fast transition is not, right? And at the center of that is this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. Developed countries are seen as most responsible for the climate catastrophe we are all facing today, and that they need to then better support in terms of financial means the transition that needs to happen also in developing countries. He also called on the G20, which South Africa, with South Africa being the incoming chair, to shift money from fossil fuel subsidies and investments to a just energy transition. AI needs to be a force for good. And he said the Pact of the Future, which was adopted at the Summit of the Future, is the compass that we need in a world that is currently in a whirlwind. Just very quickly on Brazil, President Lula speaking first year among the leaders. He talked about the world facing the highest number of conflicts. Military spending is going through the roof. He warned about what we are seeing in Lebanon as well. He talked about collective punishment of the Palestinian people, climate change being central to his conversation with member states. And he said that the biggest priority for his government was ending hunger in Brazil, which is, of course, goal 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals, Unati.
All right, let's leave it there for now, Sherwin. Thank you so much.